Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video. Today is the 18th of March. Today we have two really interesting headlines, beginning with frontline updates. Most importantly, the Ukrainian attack on Belgorod, which was largely repelled by Russian forces. We're going to look at some of the footage that came out today, along with a list of villages that were attacked. We'll also discuss other developments from Zaporozhye, where we have an interesting advance around Druzhba, for instance. And so, besides that, we'll discuss the 2 hour plus phone call between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. We'll look at the implications and the key points mentioned by both sides. But let's zoom in and begin with Zaporozhye, as this part of the front line, especially the western side of the front, has become more active since the beginning of March. This largely is due to replenishment of forces of the 108th Cossack Air Assault Regiment. They received some reinforcements, and ever since the beginning of March, they've been sending in small squads through tree lines and open fields until they arrive at the entrances to certain villages like Shcherbaki, Mali Shcherbaki, and even Stepove now. And a lot of the time, it's difficult to actually keep a permanent base of a settlement over there and develop a full-fledged attack vector. But after, I suppose, several days of high-intensity assaults and a lot of inundation with these small groups, eventually they were able to break through the line. The Ukrainians simply did not have the defensive capacity to hold on to the open fields south of this highway that then, when you look eastwards, pushes into Orkiv. So this 3 kilometer span of territory from the line of contact to the highway was an area the Russians eventually took over, and it wasn't that long before they actually took it over in its entirety. And so now they have a solid vector through which to advance from their previous positions, where you actually do have some trenches built during the Surovikin era and some of the frontline villages. And from there, moving northwards towards the newly taken settlements or villages that are currently contested that previously were under Ukrainian control. And so now the Russians have established control over most of Mali Shcherbaki and have expanded westwards. And this is very important because it means that they have the ability now to push further westwards and create a pocket and fire back that will make it more difficult for Ukrainian forces from several battalions of the 128th Mountain Assault Brigade to continue remaining in their forward positions, both in western Stepove and in Lobkove. And Lobkove, you can see they have possessions near these warehouses north of Piatikhatki and in some populated areas a bit to the north. And those are connected by some local paved routes to Kamyanske, that being the largest Ukrainian hub and garrison in the region, and then Stepove as well. You can see that over here. And so the Russians are inching closer and closer to taking over the entirety of said town. There are two geolocations backing this up. One video from the Luftwaffe FPV group of the Ukrainian side. They struck an individual Russian soldier in a warehouse in eastern Stepove. That was yesterday. And then today, the Rome unit, this new drone unit that I was not aware of previously, they conducted strikes onto individual houses. And as a result, they tried to inflict casualties on squads that were advancing along this singular route. Given the fact that this is such a small settlement, once a group and a large group that actually has a task, a local objective of taking over the entire perimeter, it becomes very difficult to fully push back the force and dissuade them from coming back. So we've seen this numerous times all across the front line, and this is only the latest example of this. Once a Russian grouping is able to seep into a certain area and establish positions in the basements of certain houses, it becomes extremely difficult to fully expel them. There are certain cases when it happens, but it requires a large concentration of forces and artillery on that specific region. And right now, you look at sort of the supply lines leading into Stepove, and it is a bit isolated from the rest of the front line. It's a bit isolated from nearby villages and from the larger Ukrainian defensive structure that is located, let's actually measure it. You can see about 6 kilometers to the north. So the Russians are in the process of seizing it in its entirety, which would give them the opportunity to flank, as I said before, Lobkove and also Kamyanske from the east. And the Rome unit added them in. They're the 2nd Battalion of the 14th Unmanned Systems Brigade, which is just this entire brigade filled with drone units. Now let's move on to an area a bit to the east. But beforehand, you could see the Russians captured over the past day over here 5.14 square kilometers of territory. In any case, over here in Constantinople, we have an interesting update. The Ukrainians are conducting a more active defense because they understand that the Russians have not shown the intentions of re-intensifying their offensive activities west of Andrivka. So, of course, they solidified control over the city itself. They got control over nearby suburbs like Ulagli and all of Konstantinopil, and that occurred a couple of weeks ago. There was footage backing that up as late as March 19th, so only about a bit more than a week ago, when the Russian forces were able to fully expel the Ukrainian holdouts over here. But it's clear, based on the deployment of forces, moving them away from Andrivka to a certain degree, and due to operational pauses for the forces that are remaining over here. And that's not to say that the Russians won't resume their attacks over here in the near future. It's just that at this present moment, they're not positioning themselves in an offensive manner, with a certain exception that we're going to look at in a moment. But Ukrainians, of course, they try to seize upon this opportunity because they're trying to take advantage of every single window of time that they have available in order to ensure they have the best tactical positions before the Russians eventually do resume their attacks. And the best way to ensure that they're able to drag out the fighting and distract the Russians from their broader objectives of advancing along this highway that's moving horizontally towards the next line of defense, being along Oleksivka and Bakhatir, and then to the border with Dnipro, would be to sort of bog down the Russian forces and concentrate all of their focus on Constantinople, because this is an area that they already have a lot of expertise in trying to hold out in, because they're able to extend the Russian attacks and really the Russian process of clearing it out by like a week and a half during the entire debacle of the Ukrainian withdrawal from Andrivka and the pockets out of it. Now it appears that there may have been a Ukrainian return into the center of the village based on the video from March 17th of the 14th Spetsnaz Brigade conducting FPV strikes. And the FPVs, they have a huge explosive yield. They were able to completely destroy these one-story houses. And then, of course, all of the roof and the structure just caves in on itself. So that obviously will lead to casualties for whoever's inside. So that's proof that the Ukrainians are located over here and have been able to infiltrate at a distance of, we can say, nearly 1 kilometer eastwards. But at the same time, we have video over here from the 79th Air Assault Brigade of their FPV strikes, and actually grenade drops, I should say, in this case, on Russian soldiers in a warehouse that is just south of Konstantinopil. This is an area that obviously is going to be easier for the Russians to push through in comparison to the areas west of Andrivka, because it's an area that's less dense in Ukrainian troop concentration. It's largely open areas. There are basically zero trenches over here, and it's just to the all the way to the approaches of Rozliv. And Rozliv is a bit disconnected from the rest of the Ukrainian garrison over here, which is largely concentrated along regions that are closer to the border with Dnipro. And so, while the Russians may not try to conduct a frontal assault to overrun the Ukrainian units over here, of which there are many, and the most active one right now is 46th Brigade pushing back into Konstantinopil, in addition to 79th, which is a bit to the south. They could focus their efforts on taking Roslev, and then that would give them an advantage from the southern flank in order to extend pressure onto the frontal positions. So right now, based on the geolocation, we can see the Russians were able to advance 2 square kilometers. Now, moving a bit to the northeast, we could see over here in the Touretsk region, the Russian forces were able to advance north of Druzhba. So this geolocation amounts to a capture of nearly 0.7 square kilometers of territory by the Russian side. This is from March 18th. The Kurt & Company FPV group of the 28th Mechanized Brigade conducted strikes onto numerous Russian turtle tanks and other armored vehicles that had a lot of slat armor and protection. And they were advancing. You could see that the maximum advance based on the polygon indicating the Russian movement is 1.6 kilometers, pushing westwards towards Dakhli itself. And so we'll have to see. We didn't really get a lot of footage of the aftermath of these strikes, but definitely the Ukrainian FPVs hit those tanks. And then it's just a question of whether the armor was sufficient in order to absorb that and allow the Russians to continue pushing forward, because there has been a lot of discussion recently of Russian movement into Dakhnia, although there are no confirmations. There's no geolocated proof of the Russians entering into this village, but definitely they have become more active near Druzhba. And then there is now the opportunity presented that the Russians could advance further northwestwards along this same route that they've used over the past day through paved routes, then arrive at Dakhnia itself. And thereby flank whatever Ukrainian garrisons are currently involved in the Turецki counterattacks that are centered around Krimske. That's a certain possibility, but we do need to see more indications of offensive activities ramping up before I can say that's occurring conclusively. Besides that, there's also an update from the Luhansk front and just to the west of the Zherebets River. I talked about this in yesterday's video, the fact that basically the final line of Ukrainian forces adjacent to the river were in an exposed position both to the south and to the north, and so it was only a matter of time before they would withdraw. And now it's happened one day later. You can see over here that the Ukrainians lost 2.6 square kilometers of territory. A geolocation from the 4th Battalion of the Separate Presidential Brigade shows that their FPV struck multiple Russian soldiers in trenches that were located in this polygon. So the Russians are now involved in strengthening their positions across this bridgehead, turning it into a much larger possession. And you could see over here the areas that are the most compromised and could be the most exposed in the coming weeks. And again, the advances over here really don't have a particular time frame or a particular tempo that is set. It really does change depending on the local situation, if there are opportunities presented. And so you have certain cases where large chunks of territory, large swaths of open fields and villages are captured within short time frames, and then you could go months without seeing any movement because that's the nature of the front over here. It is secondary or tertiary to Russia's larger objectives right now on the battlefield. But you can see this entire region that remains in Luhansk Oblast, the final 0. I don't know 1% of the oblast that remains under Ukrainian control. It is in a bit of an envelopment, not entirely, but it's an area the Russians would hope to squeeze the Ukrainians out of because they would like to seize control over the vast array of trenches built over here, and then from there push into the next line of populated areas running from Novomikhailivka to Zelena Dolina. But that region is separated from the current line of contact by a width of 7 kilometers in certain cases. And so there is a lot of this region in between that could be seized upon by the Russian side and it can be taken over with less of the attrition needed to take over a populated region. So that's something to keep an eye out for. At the same time, I really do want to look at Belgorod. That's just something that's been the most interesting to note because, of course, the Ukrainians are currently in the process of completely withdrawing from the Kursk region, and they are recuperating from that defeat, trying to also solidify a line of contact within Sumy Oblast to prevent deeper Russian penetrations. But at the same time, they've also launched some smaller scale attacks across the border a bit to the south when it comes to the distances from Kursk, from the Kursk front line right now, at least 17 kilometers in certain locations, closer to 25 kilometers. But nonetheless, you have this span of the front line that basically runs vertically from the Kursk region all the way to the south to areas like, what is this over here? Sonsitsky, this is an area that used to see a lot of fighting, and also Kozinka. We all know about the raids from last year from the RDK, for instance, the Russian affiliated forces that were fighting with the Ukrainian GUR. And they tried to infiltrate into Kozinka and they were pretty quickly repelled. So you have this region that spans, let's see, maybe 60 kilometers of front line, which is chronically undermanned by both sides. There are anti-tank ditches and dragon's teeth along most of this line over here, although you can't necessarily see it fully fleshed out on the map. You can see one of the rear lines, which is supposed to act as dragon's teeth, but there's also dragon's teeth immediately on the border with Ukraine, so there are several layers of it. Nonetheless, the mining over here isn't sufficient. There aren't mines littered across the entire border. There are certain locations where they're more dense than others, and the Ukrainians were prepared for this. They moved in a lot of engineering equipment, such as the IMRs, bringing them in to demine anything that could be a threat to their armored vehicles during a rapid advance. And so Russian sources from this location, from the Belgorod region, they noted that the Ukrainian attacks that started today in the morning, they were of a similar fashion to the attacks that were exhibited in August of 2024 and in Kursk, in the sense that the Ukrainians tried to rapidly penetrate using a surprise factor, hoping that the Russians would not notice. cross over the Dragon's Teeth with armored vehicles and try to push as deep as possible all the way to a populated area in order to then seep into that region and make it difficult for them to be expelled, and then to over time solidify control over the flanks and any routes necessary. But the immediate goal, is to at least have some sort of a modicum of presence established in a populated region. So that's what the Ukrainians try to do by infiltrating into Demidovka, but they failed to even reach the village. There's no proof of them actually entering into it. The footage that we do have, and I'm about to run through the footage and then the reports based on that footage of how much Ukrainian equipment was destroyed in the course of these attacks. So you had the sector from Marino to Demidovka, because this was an area that saw a lot of footage released, because you had Ukrainian artillery strikes and MLRS shelling, and then the Russians responding in kind, then also using Lancets and Vandal FPV drones, utilizing as well Ka 52 attack helicopters. But when it comes to the Marino Demidovka direction, there are reports that the 177th Naval Infantry Regiment destroyed two tanks, two armored fighting vehicles, and one IMR in Marino. One of the vehicles destroyed was actually a Bradley, and that was geolocated over here. I think like 700 meters from the border. You could see over here, and about 1.2 kilometers away from the village itself. So that's only from this direction, but there were a couple of the villages that were attacked a bit to the south. So you have over here uh, said this is an area that was also subjected to Ukrainian armored assaults. Russian sources claimed they destroyed one tank and one IMR in the direction of this village, and destroyed one armored fighting vehicle and one UR-77 demining system in the direction of the nearby hamlet Lipsy. So they were unable to even take over this hamlet that is enveloped on three sides by the border, by the Sumy border. And this is an indication that the small scale attacks, because this really was small in scale, we're talking about not more than like a dozen or maybe a bit more than that vehicles being utilized in total, and a large percentage of them then being destroyed as a result. The fact that the Russians have a lot of infrastructure pretty close to the Belgorod region. Of course, it's in Kursk, but it could be moved, and there will be, of course, forces closer to the rear that then can be moved quickly to respond to any infiltrations. That's always a positive for the Russian side, even if they don't have 24/7 sort of support and a complete solid line filled with a large quantity of forces all along the border over here. And so there is, of course, nuance in that regard. But you can see that even with that initial salvo of Ukrainian attacks, they were unable to attack deeper. And we'll have to see if they double down on this and try to launch attacks on an even larger scale, because part of the thinking is that it was been reported by the Russian side that two brigades were moved to the Belgorod region to get involved with these attacks. And so they would probably have more resources at their disposal to continue with this fighting if it was necessary. The unit that conducted this, I'm not aware of their identity. It could be the 47th Brigade, because of their experience with offensive activities and the fact that they have Bradleys, and Rum Bradley was targeted during the assault. But I'm not sure. It could also be a brigade or two from the air assault forces, because they're also specialized in these sort of attacks. Could even be the 22nd Mechanized, 21st Mechanized Brigade. I have no idea. We just didn't see yet. But it could be a part of Ukraine's hope that they would be distracting the Russians and diverting their attention away from pushing deeper into Sumy. That might be the logic behind these sort of operations. But I can't be sure about that. Now, when it comes to the Sumy region, the Russian forces were able to advance and take over 13 square kilometers of territory, or not 13, but 3. I don't know why I said that, and they took over most of Basivka. This is from the strike drone unit of the 47th Mechanized Brigade, which makes me think that perhaps the unit is split up between partially defending in the Sumy direction near Basivka, and then maybe also having a defensive capacity in Belgorod nearby. But at least the drone unit of the brigade, they're still in the Basivka area, and they conducted strikes onto Russian soldiers. And the fear of getting struck led one soldier to hold up his hands and surrender to the Ukrainians that were hiding in another nearby house. So the clashes do continue around here, but the Russians have been able to advance deeper, taking over forested regions, the local school, and a lot of other houses. Again, this further undermines the eastern flank and any sort of approaches in or out of Kursk Oblast. So whatever remaining areas of the Suja border crossing, Oleshnia or Gogolevka, still have a Ukrainian presence. Their ability to withdraw becomes extremely difficult now because the Russians are just so close to them. They can be spotted through daylight. They can be overlooked in numerous locations where the Russians have hills for fire supports, and then even at night, the proximity of thermal FPV drones and fiber optic FPV drones means that any sort of movement will be extremely lethal, even on a small scale basis. Which is why we're also seeing the final withdrawal from Kursk is dragging out because of the fears of larger casualties if Ukrainian soldiers were to all withdraw in unison from these locations and then expose themselves in the process. So that's just a bit of the logic behind that. Now, when it comes to the phone call between President Trump and Putin, they discussed a whole host of things. And we'll just say the most notable takeaway is that Putin agreed to a 30-day ceasefire on tax on Ukraine's electricity and energy infrastructure in return for the Ukrainians doing the same for Russian energy infrastructure. And this is interesting. I'll say this now we're at the point where winter is ending. We're transitioning into the spring period, and you also have Ukrainian efforts underway to repair the damages caused by the Russian wintertime strikes onto their power grid. And of course, there have also been increases in Russian strikes throughout the past couple of months on the Ukrainian electricity system, and US aid cut off some of the supports to the power grid recently, as was announced by the State Department. But as a whole, now that we've moved past the winter period, the demand is a bit lower, and the situation isn't really critical for the Ukrainian energy system across the entirety of the oblasts that are still under Ukraine's control. At the same time, though, the Ukrainians have been ramping up in recent weeks their attacks on Russian energy infrastructure. And so, from a Russian perspective, it is a good idea for them, on the one hand, to affirm that they would stop with the attacks that aren't right now leading to complete crises for the Ukrainian side. And at the same time, if it were to be met with some sort of reciprocal agreement by the Ukrainian side, then the attacks on their infrastructure and thereby the damage that they're suffering to their economy, the Russians, would also stop and would come to a halt for that 30-day period. So that would be a benefit for the Russians if the Ukrainians agreed to this sort of arrangement. And if they don't agree to it, then the Russians would be able to show Trump that they had displayed goodwill. It doesn't matter if it's genuine or not. It's just about the sort of optics around it. And so they would be able to show that they gave a concession, albeit one that really isn't central to Russia's overarching objectives in Ukraine, but something that could, flatter Trump and could appear to be in the right direction from his perspective. And so then it would give him goodwill with Trump and would create a negative framework around Ukraine if they were to reject it outright. So right now, Ukraine's considering it. I don't think they've made a definitive statement either way. So there is a possibility of it happening, but we have to wait and see. Besides that, there were discussions about broader negotiations about a complete ceasefire in the front line. There were separate negotiations, and they're supposed to be held in Saudi Arabia about a maritime deal for the Black Sea. So that's also going on. But once again, Putin reiterated his terms for a ceasefire and then eventually an end to the war. And it includes a pause on Ukrainian mobilization during a ceasefire period and any sort of rearmament, including from the United States, which would mean it necessitates the United States stopping its intelligence sharing and military aid to Ukraine, as we saw occur like 2 weeks ago, and then it got resumed last week. So Putin really tried to stress the need for those sort of concessions in order to move forward with an end to the war. That was set to Trump, and I don't think Trump and the Trump administration have actually made a public statement about that demand from Putin, but they definitely are aware of it. At the same time, both the US and Russia affirmed the need to improve their bilateral relations, and that includes some smaller things like organizing a hockey game between the United States and Russia, and also just improving their economic cooperation and potential long term energy deals. And then also the need to just continue with this sort of dialogue. Putin said that they would release 23 Ukrainian soldiers, prisoners of war that are seriously wounded. And he also said that there would be a prisoner swap, 175 for 175, so an equal amount being given back to Ukraine and the same amount being given to Russia. So all of this trying to appease Trump and show that the Russians do have some sort of overarching agreement in principle with Trump on ending the war. That's at least the way that the Putin tried to frame it to Trump in order to ensure there does remain goodwill and that relations with the United States could be mended, with the hope that eventually the United States would acquiesce to Russia's demands of permanently ending the aid to Ukraine. But again, the important takeaway is that Putin did not commit to the same 30-day ceasefire agreement that Zelensky did because of the irreconcilable differences in the approaches and overall objectives that Putin has, and sort of the red lines that has when it comes to negotiations, whether it be territory, although that wasn't explicitly mentioned, but it's just sort of like an implicitly known thing that, well, between the Trump administration and Putin, that there would be some sort of land annexation, and there was even talks. These are rumors, so I can't say this definitively, of a trade between the Odessa port and the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, which again, that's a massive shift. It would be really insane sort of negotiation swap between the Russians and Ukrainians. And so I don't know how realistic that is from either side's perspective, but the point is, all the talk about the energy strikes and halting them, that's really peripheral, and it's besides the point of the main core issue of continuing the war in order to achieve Russia's war objectives, and only stopping it if those are sort of attained to a certain degree. And until that happens, then we can't say that there has been a significant and earnest advance when it comes to actually brokering a deal for peace between the United States, Russia, and Ukraine. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.